Hello folks, tonight we plunge into the murky past of a world where drinking a glass of water could quite literally be the last thing anyone ever did. The rivers looked peaceful, sure, but they doubled as open sewers, animal baths, laundry pits, and sometimes unofficial cemeteries. Wells offered refreshment in theory, but in practice they delivered dysentery with a side of slow despair. From medieval cities to quiet rural villages, water was not trusted. It was tolerated at best and outright feared at worst. And when the most dangerous thing in the world was the thing people needed to survive, something had to fill the cup. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In many parts of medieval Europe, the idea of drinking plain water was about as popular as licking a mouldy turnip. The reason was straightforward. Water sources were, for the most part, disgusting. Town streams flowed with the runoff of tanneries, latrines, and unfortunate livestock. Wells were shallow, often dug a polite 10 steps away from a privy. Springs were nice when they could be found, but even those came with a lingering suspicion that the spirits guarding them had questionable hygiene. So people adapted, not with filters or science, not yet, but with brewing kettles, honey, fruit skins, and barrels. They drank things that had been boiled, fermented, soured, or steeped. It might not have tasted good, but it did not kill them quite as often. Ale was the beverage of choice. And not the party-starting kind, but the weak, bready, small beer version that bubbled quietly in every household. It was essentially cold, yeasty oatmeal in a cup, and even toddlers drank it. Not because it was nutritious, because it was boiled. This is not to say people never drank water. But when they did, it was with hesitation, prayer, or peer pressure, sometimes all three. If the river looked especially clear and someone else drank it and did not immediately fall over, maybe it was safe. Maybe. There was a certain logic to the choices people made. They did not know about bacteria, but they understood patterns. If half the neighborhood got sick after a festival, they remembered what was in the communal bucket. Historians still argue whether these water fears were universal or more common in crowded towns where water became a kind of terrifying communal soup. In rural settings where a spring might stay unspoiled and a cow less likely to walk through it, water had a slightly better reputation. But even then, people leaned towards something brewed. It was tradition and also survival instinct disguised as cultural habit. In some regions, wells were whispered about like troubled relatives. Not just dangerous, but haunted. Someone drowns mysteriously and suddenly the villagers begin leaving offerings by the stone rim and muttering apologies. Bad luck did not always mean contamination. Sometimes it meant someone had upset the water. Oddly enough, despite all the boiling that went into beer and mead, the idea of simply boiling water to make it safe was not a widespread practice. Fire was available. Water was everywhere. But boiling water for drinking, that idea shows up far less often than expected, possibly because beer had the bonus of calories, taste, and that ever-so-gentle buzz. One fringe theory from the period suggested that water was simply too raw for the human body, that it needed tempering with spices, warmth, or at the very least, a bit of honey. Cold water, some believed, shocked the stomach and weakened the spirit. Warm ale, by contrast, felt like a hug in a mug. In monasteries and manor kitchens, brews bubbled constantly, not just ales, but weak wines, herbal tisanes, and vinegar-spiked concoctions. People tried everything. Rainwater was collected sometimes, strained through charcoal or old cloth. Some households relied on instinct, If the dog drank it and lived, it passed the test. A highly scientific method, depending on how many dogs were available. There were also, of course, the show-offs. The occasional noble or merchant who insisted that their estate's spring was pure and cold and as clear as crystal. They would pour a cup with great ceremony, sip dramatically, and possibly spend the next week very quietly dying. But image was everything. Clean water, when it could be found, was celebrated almost reverently. A rare spring might be declared holy. People made pilgrimages to bathe in it, collect it, whisper secrets to it. Sometimes those springs stayed clean. Sometimes a nearby farmer redirected his drainage ditch and the miracle turned septic. It is easy to imagine a morning centuries ago. A child wakes up thirsty and reaches for a cup. Not of water, but of beer. A thin, cloudy liquid served in a wood or clay mug. It smells a little sour, tastes like bread crust, and leaves the lips dry. But it is safe. Or at least safer than trusting the well. That is how most days began. And that habit stuck. Over generations it became custom. Ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, wine for supper if one could afford it, mead or cider if there were apples or honey to spare. But always something other than water. Not because people were uncivilized, but because they were trying, in the face of invisible dangers, to make it to tomorrow. Some monasteries, ever inventive, treated brewing as both divine work and a delicious loophole. Monks experimented with fermentation ratios, herbal additions, and even storage methods. While the average peasant brewed in rough barrels behind their home, monasteries developed sprawling brew houses where nothing went to waste, and everything eventually turned into drink. And yes, there were charts in cities. Taverns often served what passed for drinking establishments and neighborhood public health clinics. No one was ordering cocktails, but a mug of whatever was on tap might be safer than the water from the churchyard well. Sometimes a local healer might add herbs to a cask, yarrow, elderflower, mint, and claim it protected against plague. Whether it worked is debatable. Whether people drank it anyway, absolutely. Even traveling merchants carried flasks of something stronger. A few sips of vinegar water mixed with herbs was a common choice, thought to ward off illness and settle the stomach. It was not tasty, but when one's other option was scooping water from a roadside ditch, flavor took a backseat to not dying. As the centuries passed, the fear of water calcified into ritual. Some towns had local rules about who could draw from what source. In places where water was exceptionally bad, it was common to see a full barrel of ale in the home, but no cup ever dipped into the well except for washing clothes or watering plants. Entire generations grew up barely ever tasting pure water. It was just not done. One of the more peculiar customs involved toasting to health, because when everything you drank was technically medicine, the line between wellness and celebration got blurry. You were not just sharing a drink. You were warding off fate. And if someone skipped a toast, suspicious. When outbreaks of disease swept through towns, the first suspicion often landed on the water. Wells were sometimes ritually cleansed, not with bleach, obviously, but with prayers, coins, or the occasional dead chicken, depending on the local traditions. If that sounds unhygienic, remember, they did not know better, but they did know that clean water should not smell like cabbage and regret. And then there were the disasters. The times when people had no choice but to rely on whatever water they could get. During sieges, floods, or droughts, ale production could grind to a halt. Rain barrels grew algae, wells dried out or overflowed, and people drank what was left, knowing it might not end well. Sometimes it was that, or nothing. But in ordinary times, the rule of thumb was simple. If it frothed a little and tasted vaguely of smoke and old bread, it was probably fine. If it was clear and tasted like nothing, that was the real danger. The sun rises over a crooked rooftop. and the first thing to reach the lips of a medieval labourer is not water, it is ale. Thin, flat, slightly sour ale, what people today might generously call small beer. It is not a treat nor a reward, it is breakfast. For much of pre-modern Europe, ale was not reserved for taverns or feasts. It was a daily staple present at every meal and in nearly every home. It was brewed in backyards, kitchens, and monastic cellars. Entire families participated in its production, from gathering malted grain to skimming foam off bubbling barrels. Ale was not merely a beverage, it was a tool for survival. The idea of starting the day with an alcoholic drink sounds alarming to modern sensibilities, but this was not alcohol as people now understand it. Small beer contained very little alcohol, barely enough to dull the edges, certainly not enough to cause intoxication unless consumed by the bucket. And it often was. Buckets, mugs, ladles, whatever held liquid could carry it to the lips of farmers, shepherds, servants, and schoolchildren alike. Even monks drank it before prayer. In fact, children drank small beer routinely. There was no scandal in it. It was simply the default beverage, and it happened to be less deadly than water. Parents, if they thought about it at all, probably believed the mild alcohol content would keep their offspring calm, quiet, and slightly sleepy, which, given the number of shared beds and squeaky floorboards in a peasant's home, may have been considered a parenting win. Households often designated a specific person, usually a woman, to oversee the brewing. In small communities, she might be the local alewife, a title of honor and necessity. An alewife knew how to judge grain by scent, stir kettles without scorching, and time a fermentation using nothing more than instinct and lunar gossip. Some historians believe alewives were among the earliest female entrepreneurs, selling excess brew to neighbors or bartering it for meat, eggs, or gossip. The ale itself was not consistent. One batch might be barely drinkable, the next might sparkle with unexpected clarity. Ingredients varied wildly depending on region, availability, and desperation. Barley was common, but oats, rye, or whatever grain could be mashed into a paste might end up in the pot. Hops were not universal yet. In many parts of Europe, people flavored their ale with herbs and spices, sometimes pleasant ones like rosemary or yarrow, and sometimes things that sounded more like a potion than a pint. The brewing process itself was more survival ritual than science. Water was boiled, grains steeped, mixtures cooled, and fermentation began. No one used thermometers. No one used sterilization. Everything depended on the season, the quality of grain, and how many flies decided to investigate the vat. A good alewife was a kind of wizard. Monasteries elevated the process to a higher art. They had access to better equipment, more consistent grain, and, perhaps most importantly, time. Monks recorded brewing practices with the same reverence they reserved for prayers and livestock accounting. Recipes were guarded, procedures were debated. Some abbeys became famous for their brews, and it is no coincidence that the descendants of those monastic drinks still sit on shelves today. People did not drink ale for fun. It was not about merriment or relaxation. It was hydration with benefits, boiled water, a few calories, and a touch of fortification. A poor person might go their entire life without ever sipping plain water on purpose, but they would remember the taste of their mother's ale, the sting of a sour batch, or the smoothness of a well-aged monk's brew shared on a holy day. Historians still argue whether small beer was truly safe or just relatively less dangerous than water. It certainly helped that brewing required boiling, which killed many of the bacteria and parasites plaguing wells and rivers. However, storage was often questionable, barrels were rarely cleaned, and mold was considered more of an aesthetic problem than a biological one. Still, people who drank ale seemed to die slightly less often of mysterious stomach issues than those who drank whatever came out of the ground. Even the act of drinking ale became part of the rhythm of life. Meals were soaked in it. Bread was dipped in it. Grains left over from brewing became animal feed, and the dregs might be used to scrub floors or flavor porridge. Nothing went to waste. Ale was not just consumed, it was embedded. In towns, taverns served as both social centers and hydration hubs. One might wander into a dark room at mid-morning and find it filled with workers, sipping small beer before returning to carts and cobbles. Children might be perched on stools, cradling mugs larger than their heads. There was no stigma, no shame. It was not indulgence, it was normal. There were downsides, of course. Not everyone brewed well. Poor quality ale could make a person just as sick as questionable water. And there were moments when fermentation went too far and mild buzz became accidental nap in the chicken yard. But on the whole, ale was reliable. It might not taste like much, but it kept people standing, walking, talking, and most importantly, breathing. Ale also became a measure of class. The rich drank wine, the clergy drank spiced mead, and the poor drank ale. Within that framework, the quality of one's drink said something about one's place. A smooth, nutty, small beer suggested a well-stocked kitchen and a patient hand. A sour, burnt concoction hinted at bad grain, bad luck, or both. Over time, regulations appeared. Some towns passed laws about ale quality. Ale tasters, yes, that was a real title, were appointed to make sure the brew sold in public houses met a certain standard. If a tavern's ale was too weak, too strong, or simply offensive to the tongue, fines could be levied. The ale taster was not always beloved, but he was respected, or at least feared. There were other laws as well. Some towns set fixed prices for ale, adjusted by season. Others limited who could sell it and where. In larger cities, guilds formed around brewing. In smaller villages, everyone knew who made the good stuff and who used spoiled oats. Word traveled. When famine struck and grain supplies dwindled, ale production dropped. Suddenly, the village well looked more tempting and more dangerous. Illness rose, people grumbled, and suddenly brewing was not just a domestic task, it was a public service. In especially rough years, people brewed with whatever they could find: peas, turnips, even chestnuts. The resulting drinks were memorable, possibly traumatic, but they were liquid, and sometimes that was enough. Some folkloric remedies claimed that adding certain herbs to ale could ward off curses, infertility, or the neighbor's evil eye. Others believed that brewing on certain days, Fridays, holy days, or during a waxing moon, produced better results. Whether or not those tricks worked, they added flavor to the ritual. Brewing was a craft, yes, but also a superstition, a hope, a bubbling prayer. By the end of a typical day, a person might have consumed several mugs of ale without ever thinking twice about it. It was part of work, part of meals, part of sleep. Some households drank it warm, some cool, and some directly from the bucket. And through it all, people lived, not perfectly, not painlessly, but with fewer intestinal catastrophes than if they had dared to rely on the well. Small beer may not sound glamorous, but in a world where a cup of water could be your last, it was nothing short of heroic. Wine holds a reputation today as a drink of elegance, of candlelit dinners and dusty cellars. In medieval Europe, however, it was rarely so romantic. Wine was not just reserved for nobles swirling goblets and quoting poetry. It was everywhere, on monastery tables, at village feasts, in soldiers' kits, and even in the hands of scribes scratching out letters by poor candlelight. From the Roman Empire through the medieval period, wine flowed steadily across much of Europe. Vineyards spread through warm climates, from the Mediterranean hills of Italy and Spain to the valleys of France and the Rhineland. Wherever the climate allowed grapes to grow, wine production followed. Even regions where grapes struggled to ripen developed a taste for importing the stuff, and people found creative ways to stretch, preserve, or disguise what little they had. Despite its ubiquity, wine was not always pleasant. In fact, most medieval wine would likely make a modern sommelier weep into their decanter. The concept of aging wine gracefully in oak barrels had not yet refined itself into the science it would later become. Instead, wine was made quickly, stored poorly, and spoiled rapidly. If a person did not drink it within a few months or weeks, it turned sour. And not in a charming, tangy way, more like, "This has been in the sun too long, sour." To compensate, people added all manner of things: honey, spices, herbs, even chalk or ash. Anything to cut the acidity and pretend that the smell did not signal impending regret. A common practice involved boiling the wine down into a syrup, then reconstituting it later. The result was sweet, thick, and vaguely medicinal. In a world where water could kill, this passed for luxury. The Romans had already understood that wine could be both status symbol and survival tool. They introduced the drink wherever their empire reached, planting vineyards and building taverns everywhere. Their soldiers drank wine daily, often diluted with water, which ironically may have made the water safer by lowering the microbial load. Medieval people inherited these habits, though few knew they were following Roman traditions. Wine simply remained part of life. Monasteries played a major role in preserving and refining winemaking traditions. Monks planted some of the best vineyards in Europe, tended them with patience, and recorded notes that, while spiritual in tone, often hinted at experimentation. They knew which hills received the right light. They knew how much rain ruined a harvest. They knew how to pray over a barrel in just the right key. Wine also held sacred status. In the Christian Church, wine became the blood of Christ during Mass. That meant even communities that normally could not afford wine made sure to obtain at least enough for religious purposes. It was not uncommon for peasants to drink weak ale all week and then receive a single drop of wine on Sunday. That drop carried weight, both spiritual and symbolic. Historians still debate how widely wine was consumed outside of religious and noble settings. In southern Europe, wine was relatively affordable and more common across all social classes. In the north, where grapes struggled, it became a luxury. Imported wine cost more, and local brews, usually beer, ale, or mead, dominated the table. Yet even in these places, wine appeared during holidays, weddings, and funerals. It marked important moments. Because wine spoiled so easily, people often resorted to mixtures. Mulled wine, for example, featured cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar. Though not all of these ingredients were available everywhere or at all times, wealthy households might simmer their wine in bronze pots with fruit peels and serve it warm in pewter goblets. Poorer folk might simply add a twig of something fragrant and hope for the best. The medical world, such as it was, praised wine. Doctors recommended it for digestion, sleep, and melancholy. Specific wines were thought to balance humours: red for warmth, white for cooling the blood. If a person felt sluggish, a few sips of spiced wine might be prescribed. If one felt too energetic, more wine. The solution was often, curiously, always wine. One particularly odd fringe practice involved soaking herbs in wine and applying the mixture to wounds. The idea was that the alcohol would cleanse and the herb would heal. In some cases, this may have worked better than expected. In others, it was simply an expensive way to waste both resources and time. Regardless, wine and medicine walked hand in hand for centuries, often guided more by guesswork than effectiveness. In noble households, wine culture grew elaborate. There were designated cupbearers, specialized jugs, and even etiquette guides about how to offer and receive a pour. Tasting wine became part of the meal, with hosts eager to display their collection, though collection here might mean a few clay amphorae hidden behind a curtain. The point was not quantity, it was refinement, that and not dying from contaminated stream water. For the poor, wine represented something just out of reach. A merchant might save for weeks to buy a bottle for a feast. A peasant might receive a flask as a gift. Children might never taste it unless they entered the priesthood or got lucky during a festival. But everyone knew what wine symbolized. It was not just fermented grape juice, it was civilization in a cup, the proof that humanity could coax sweetness from soil. In taverns, wine was rarely served straight. It was cut with water, reheated, or mixed with whatever local concoction passed for sweetener. The goal was not purity, the goal was palatability. If it was drinkable and did not cause hallucinations or vomiting, then the barkeeper considered it a success. Patrons agreed. The storage of wine was its own gamble. Barrels leaked, clay jugs cracked, oxidation ruined more than it preserved. Wealthy estates sometimes built underground cellars to store wine at consistent temperatures, but even these were prone to rodents, mold, and accidents involving clumsy servants. Many households simply buried amphorae in the ground and hoped for a mild winter. In colder climates, wine froze. In hotter climates, it turned into vinegar. In both cases, people adapted. Vinegar wine became a base for cooking or added to medicinal syrups. Frozen wine was thawed near the fire, where it lost its bouquet but gained warmth. People were resourceful, they had to be. Because wine was seen as both holy and healing, it occupied a strange duality. It was offered to kings and beggars, priests and plague victims. A person might drink wine to celebrate a birth, then pour a libation on a grave. It transcended class, if only briefly. When the wine came out, something sacred lingered in the room, whether that room was a stone chapel or a dirt-floored hut. There were also frauds. Vendors who watered down their stock, dyed white wine to look like red, or filled old barrels with musty leftovers and charged a premium. Towns passed ordinances against this. Some required public tasting booths. Others allowed buyers to inspect a seller's barrels before purchase. One town even created a measuring stick for how full a barrel needed to be. Too low and the merchant paid a fine or worse. Yet despite its faults, wine endured. It traveled on trade routes. It appeared in epic poems. It soaked into legends. It was poured for emperors and spilled by fools. And in a time when water might carry parasites, sewage, or death itself, wine remained, stubbornly, the drink that meant one might still wake up in the morning. Wine was not a luxury because of its flavor. It was a luxury because of what it was not. It was not a gamble. It was not a stream beside a leper's hut. It was not a barrel full of hope and cholera. It was, for those who could afford it, a predictable escape. And sometimes that was worth every drop. There is a fire, there is a pot, there is water inside that pot, and yet no one drinks it. That is the strange paradox of medieval life. Boiling water was not unheard of. It was done frequently, for cooking, for brewing, for laundry, for making gruel that could technically be called soup. But for drinking, that was another story entirely. The idea of simply boiling water to make it safe to drink was not part of the common worldview. It seems painfully obvious now. Heat kills germs. Clean water reduces illness. Yet in the medieval mind, those connections had not yet been established. Boiling water was viewed as a culinary step, not a survival tactic. It was the prelude to turning water into something else, not the end result. When people boiled water, it was to transform it into broth, porridge, beer, or tea. Plain boiled water held no cultural weight. It lacked flavor, richness, energy. It felt incomplete. The absence of a final ingredient was not comforting. It was suspect. Drinking hot water on purpose was something you did when you were ill or strange. This gap in understanding meant that boiling water was not part of disease prevention. People may have noticed that beer drinkers survived plagues more often than water drinkers, but they attributed this to divine favor, strong blood, or sheer luck, not to the act of boiling liquid in a pot. Historians still debate whether any communities independently developed a practice of boiling water solely for safety. If they did, the records did not survive. Monasteries and learned households came closer. They prepared concoctions using boiled water and herbs, sometimes for the sick, sometimes for rituals. Some of these were effectively medicinal. A tisane of mint, steeped in boiled water, could soothe stomach aches. Elderflower brews, while not fully understood, offered mild immune benefits. But even then, the water was not the point. It was a vessel, a delivery system for healing things. The water itself remained invisible. In wealthier homes, servants boiled water for washing and bathing. Sometimes this water cooled and was used for other tasks. But again, no one poured it into a cup for sipping. The closest most people came to that was broth. Broth was sacred. A bone simmered long enough turned liquid into nourishment. It was not just warm, it was full of strength, memory, and fat. People trusted broth. Water, however, remained questionable. Part of the problem may have been perception. Cold water felt fresh, clean, alive. Boiled water was warm, dull, and flat. If you were going to go through the trouble of heating it, why not throw in some barley, or herbs, or dried apples? Anything to make it feel like a proper drink, not just a hot mistake. In winter, warm drinks were prized, but again, these drinks had substance. Spiced wine, mulled ale, milk with a hint of honey. Warm water, unflavored, was considered weak. It was what you gave someone when everything else had run out. It was what you drank while coughing beside a hearth, swaddled in too many tunics, wondering whether you would see spring. It did not comfort. It reminded. Doctors of the time, those who based their practices on humors and planetary alignments, warned against hot water. It was thought to unbalance the body's inner temperatures. The stomach, they said, needed warm food but not hot liquid. Cold water, meanwhile, could shock the system. And so people lived in a strange in-between. Water was risky, both cold and hot, and neither option brought much comfort. A few thinkers speculated on water purity. Some writers in the Islamic Golden Age discussed filtration. Others in ancient Rome recommended using charcoal or sand. But these ideas did not spread widely or quickly. In medieval Europe, the village mindset held firm. Water, as it came from the earth, was not to be trusted. The only way to improve it was to change it, ferment it, sweeten it, hide it. Brewing ale was one of the few processes where water was reliably boiled, not just once, but often twice. Grains required steeping, mashing, and sparging, a process that involved pouring hot water through the mash to extract sugars. This meant that nearly every drop of ale had gone through at least one good boil. And yet, people did not make the logical leap to apply that same treatment to water for its own sake. If they did, it was rare enough that chroniclers did not mention it. Some folk remedies advised pouring hot water over herbs and inhaling the steam. This was common for colds and fevers. But again, it was not about drinking. It was about breathing, about cleansing the head, about ritual. Water was never the star, it was always the assistant. During times of crisis, sieges, famines, plagues, people became desperate. Water from the well might be muddy, water from the stream might be clogged with bodies or waste. In these moments, someone might boil water to strain out the visible filth, but the goal was not sterilization. It was optics. If it looked better, it must be safer. That was the logic, not microbes, not pathogens, just appearance. It is worth remembering that the very concept of invisible illness was foreign. Disease had smell, it had color, it had curses. It did not ride on droplets or cling to undercooked food. Germ theory would not arrive for centuries, and until it did, boiling water for cleanliness remained an accidental blessing, not an intentional one. One of the few consistent exceptions came from travelers. Those on long journeys sometimes boiled water out of necessity. Streams were unpredictable. Rain barrels unreliable. Soldiers and pilgrims needing something warm and fast might boil water over a campfire and add whatever was nearby: dried herbs, onion skins, stale bread, bits of salted meat. The result was always more than water, but the act of boiling became habit. Even then, many travelers preferred to carry wine or ale in skins. A wineskin swinging from the hip was not just for show. It was armor against thirst and dysentery. Some added vinegar to their water, a mixture known in ancient times as posca. This sour, diluted drink had staying power. It masked bad flavors and discouraged some bacteria. Roman soldiers drank it. Medieval peasants rediscovered it. It was not delicious, but it was serviceable. In urban centers where water contamination was worst, people learned not to ask questions. They drank beer, they drank wine, and they drank watered-down fruit syrups if they had access to orchards. In wealthier homes, fruit preserves were mixed into hot water to make a kind of proto-tea. This was more common in the late Middle Ages as sugar became slightly more available, but again the focus was on sweetness. The water merely carried it. Tea itself would not arrive in Europe until the 17th century, long after the worst water habits had calcified into tradition. When it did arrive, along with coffee, it brought with it the consistent practice of boiling water. That shift would change habits slowly, then suddenly. Boiled water became a baseline, not a mistake. But that future was centuries away. In medieval times, the fire burned, the pot simmered, but the cup waited for something else: a root, a leaf, a grain, a prayer. Plain boiled water simply did not exist in the public imagination. It was too empty, too flavorless, too modern. And so people brewed, they steeped, they fermented, and they hoped. Tucked behind high stone walls and under the eaves of tiled cloisters, monasteries in medieval Europe simmered with a quiet, fragrant energy. Beyond the chants and the copied texts, another sacred practice took place: brewing. It was not merely a domestic necessity, it was an act of order, of discipline, of service. And sometimes it was the most hygienic thing anyone within 50 miles could consume. Monastic brewing developed slowly but thoroughly. As early as the 6th century, monks had begun cultivating vineyards and barley fields. By the high Middle Ages, they had transformed brewing into a kind of divine engineering. Recipes were written in margins, schedules were carved into wooden beams, copper kettles hissed in the early hours of the morning, long before the first prayers of the day. Monks brewed for many reasons. They drank ale with meals. They distributed it to the poor. They used it to support travelers, fund hospitals, and fill the cups of visiting bishops. But underneath all that, there was another reason. It was safer than water. Even if they did not fully understand why, monks knew that boiled, fermented liquids caused fewer deaths than clear, still water from the garden cistern. The ale they produced was varied. Some monasteries brewed extremely weak table beer, meant for daily consumption, and shared even with children. Others made heavier brews, strong enough to numb pain and blur memories, though these were usually reserved for holy festivals or ill patients who could not keep food down. The most complex brews, thick, malty, dark, were seasonal. They accompanied Lent, harvest feasts, or the long, hungry stretches of winter. Monks measured carefully. They recorded proportions of malt to water, durations of fermentation, and even methods for purifying wooden barrels. Some employed sand, others smoke, and still others invoked prayers as a kind of spiritual sterilization. These were not casual hobbyists. These were men who believed their brew houses were as important as their chapels. One fringe theory among some monastic writers suggested that alcohol, used properly, could reveal divine order. The balance of yeast and grain, the transformation from water to ale, mirrored the transformation of the soul. Whether that theory was universally accepted remains unclear, but it certainly justified a great deal of experimentation. Historians still discuss how many monasteries across Europe were brewing simultaneously by the 13th century. The number is uncertain, but the impact is undeniable. Monks influenced both technique and taste. They improved storage, introduced specific strains of yeast, and began classifying ales by strength and color. They created consistency in a world that otherwise brewed by guesswork and instinct. Brewing was also practical. It provided income. Monasteries that produced surplus beer sold it in nearby towns or exchanged it for grain and supplies. In this way, a humble drink became a lifeline. Even nobles sometimes preferred monastic ale, believing it to be cleaner, smoother, or simply more trustworthy than whatever was bubbling behind the local tavern. Some monasteries employed lay workers to help with the brewing. These assistants lived outside the main cloister but followed strict rules. They harvested hops, monitored the cooling rooms, and carried barrels to cellars dug deep into the earth. The best of them were treated with great respect, known by name, invited to eat with the monks, and sometimes granted a portion of the stronger brew as thanks. Brewing also allowed monks to provide for the sick. Ale was often easier to digest than food and contained enough calories to sustain someone too weak to chew. Special batches were brewed for infirmaries, gentle, nourishing, sometimes laced with herbs like sage or wormwood. In an era without antibiotics, a warm cup of monk's ale might be the closest thing to medicine available. These brews were not just sanitary, they were flavorful. Spices, dried fruits, and honey were added when available. Some monasteries experimented with oak aging or buried their barrels to keep them cool through summer. The result was a range of drinks that, while not resembling modern beer exactly, had depth, complexity, and a sense of place. Certain monasteries became famous. Pilgrims traveled not only for spiritual healing, but for the taste of a particular ale. Stories spread, whether true or not, of brews so pure they could cure fevers, settle disputes, or reveal visions. A monk's reputation might hinge on the clarity of his beer. A scandal over a bad batch could linger for decades. One particularly curious practice was the beer blessing. Before distributing a new brew, some monasteries would gather in the brewhouse, recite prayers, and sprinkle holy water on the vats. It was half ritual, half quality control. If the brew turned sour afterward, someone might question whether the blessing was done properly, or whether someone in the group had failed to confess a sin. Not all monasteries succeeded. Some struggled with infection in their vats. Others faced accusations of selling ale that was too strong, too sour, or too expensive. Town governments occasionally intervened, fearing that monastic breweries might undercut local producers or encourage overindulgence. But the best brew houses maintained a delicate balance between duty, economy, and flavor. Outside the cloister, the monastic influence spread. Towns copied their methods. Merchants bought their barrels and tried to replicate the flavor. Lay brewers began to track temperature and fermentation length, not because they understood microbiology, but because the monks had shown that consistency could be profitable. It was not just about avoiding death by water, it was about building trust in a cup. When someone lifted a tankard of monastic ale, they believed they were drinking something crafted with care, with reverence, with a deeper purpose. It might not have been accurate, but the belief was powerful. Brewing also helped reinforce the monastery's role as provider. A person might walk 20 miles in cold rain, soaked through, starving and trembling. Upon arriving at the gate, he would be offered not water, but ale. Not strong ale, not intoxicating ale, but warm, soft, life-giving ale. That gesture, repeated across centuries, gave monasteries a reputation not just for piety, but for generosity. During times of famine, when crops failed and meat vanished from markets, ale remained. It was filling. It could be brewed with grains too damaged for bread, but still usable after boiling. Some monasteries even opened their gates to the public during brewing days, allowing villagers to collect leftover mash for animal feed or to brew a thinner version at home. Even as political tides shifted and some monasteries fell into disrepair or were dissolved, their brewing practices lived on. Lay brewers absorbed them. Recipes were copied, adapted, and refined. Some even claimed to use yeast passed down from ancient abbeys. Whether true or not, the myth had marketing value. It is easy to overlook the brew house when thinking about monastic life. The scriptorium, the chapel, the gardens, they all loom large in historical imagination. But the brewing room was just as sacred. It was warm, it was fragrant, and it was life-sustaining. When the bells rang for evening prayers, some monks knelt with sore hands and malt-stained robes. Their offering was not words, but barrels lined in tidy rows, each one a small miracle of chemistry and care. In a world where drinking water could shorten your life, the monks lengthened it, one quiet brew at a time. The milk was warm, not in the cozy poured-over porridge way, but in the it sat in a wooden pail for 2 hours way. And yet, for many medieval people, milk remained one of the few drinks that straddled the blurry line between nourishment and hydration. It was not ideal, it was not always available, but it was familiar, and sometimes that was enough. Milk, by nature, is a perishable thing. In a world without refrigeration, it turned quickly, especially during summer months. Fresh milk spoiled within hours, separating, souring, and becoming a breeding ground for everything that made a person regret their life choices. And still, people drank it, carefully, sparingly, usually when there was no other option. Cows, sheep, and goats produced milk, and all were kept by medieval households depending on region and climate. Cow's milk was most common in northern Europe, goat's milk in rocky or mountainous areas, and sheep's milk in warmer climates where cows struggled. The type of milk depended not on taste preferences, but on terrain and tolerance. Milk, when consumed fresh, was usually a morning drink. It came straight from the animal, still warm, and was sometimes sprinkled with spices or mixed with bits of bread. Children drank it more often than adults. Pregnant women were encouraged to drink it for strength. The elderly were sometimes given warm milk to help them sleep. But for the average labourer, milk was a luxury, one that spoiled before midday and attracted flies by the dozen. Historians still debate how widespread the practice of drinking raw milk truly was. In urban areas where keeping livestock posed logistical and legal challenges, milk was either non-existent or purchased from questionable vendors. These vendors carried pails through the streets, shouting prices and pouring ladles into ceramic mugs. There were no safety checks, no temperature control, and no refunds. One poor decision and a person might spend the next week revisiting their lunch. In rural settings, milk was safer, if only because people knew the animals producing it. They controlled the cleanliness of the stable, the condition of the buckets, and the timing of the milking. They knew whether a cow had eaten something suspicious and they trusted their own instincts about when milk had turned. It was not science, it was experience. Because of its short shelf life, most milk was not drunk at all. It was turned into something else, usually as fast as possible. Butter, cheese, yogurt, curds, these were the end game. Milk, raw and vulnerable, was simply the raw material. The real value lay in what it could become. Transformation meant longevity, it meant safety, it meant trade. Butter was churned in wooden barrels, sometimes flavored with herbs or salt. Cheese took longer, but kept for weeks or even months if stored correctly. Hard cheeses traveled, soft cheeses were consumed quickly. Yogurt-like drinks appeared in some regions, especially where Islamic or Eastern European influences spread fermentation techniques. These drinks were tangy, slightly sour, and sometimes effervescent, closer to liquid cheese than milk. Fermented milk drinks had an advantage. They were less likely to cause illness, especially when mixed with honey or herbs. Some were believed to aid digestion, calm the mind, or ease joint pain. A few even appeared in medical texts recommended for specific ailments. Whether they worked is debatable, but they were at least less hazardous than whatever lurked in the village well. One fringe belief, common in parts of Central Europe, claimed that milk taken from a cow at dawn, before it had eaten or moved much, was pure and carried spiritual benefits. Some families collected this milk in separate vessels, reserved it for the sick, or offered it during religious rituals. It was not boiled, not altered, just sipped slowly in quiet reverence. Whether it helped or not, no one dared to question the tradition. Milk also played a symbolic role. It was associated with motherhood, purity, and abundance. In Christian iconography, the Virgin Mary was sometimes depicted nursing the infant Christ, and milk became a metaphor for divine nourishment. This symbolism occasionally translated into practice. New mothers were fed extra dairy to strengthen their own milk supply, while midwives encouraged the use of goat's milk when breastfeeding was not possible. Goat's milk, in particular, had a reputation for being gentler on the stomach. It was often given to infants, the elderly, or the infirm. In areas with no access to cows, goats served as walking milk dispensers. They ate nearly anything, climbed anything, and complained loudly while doing it. But they produced reliable milk, and in tight conditions that reliability meant survival. Sheep's milk was less common for drinking and more often used for cheese. However, in certain regions of Italy, the Balkans, and the Middle East, it was consumed fresh or turned into fermented drinks. These were thick, tangy, and full of fat. In colder months, they were warmed and mixed with cloves or garlic. In warmer months, they were chilled in ceramic jugs, cooling both the drink and the expectations. In cities, dairy products were more accessible to the rich than the poor. Nobles could afford fresh milk delivered daily. They had servants to test it, kitchens to store it, and cooks to disguise it if things had gone slightly sour. Poorer households relied on preserved dairy, cheese, dried curds, or buttermilk when available. If they drank fresh milk, it was often from their own livestock, and even then, only seasonally. Because milk spoiled so quickly, there were also superstitions surrounding its storage. Some households placed protective charms near the dairy shelf. Others chalked protective symbols on milk buckets. It was not just bacteria people feared, it was witches. Milk that curdled too fast, turned yellow, or developed an odd texture could be blamed on a neighbor's ill will. Milk theft, both real and imagined, was taken seriously. In some villages, accusations of souring milk led to trials, confessions, or worse. To avoid temptation, some farmers milked their cows before dawn or just before dusk, believing it made the milk less likely to attract unwanted spiritual attention. If that sounds paranoid, consider how vital a few pints of milk were in a poor household. When one's survival depends on a single goat or cow, every precaution feels justified. During times of crisis, famine, drought, or plague, milk became even more valuable. It fed children when grain ran out. It kept the sick alive when nothing else could be kept down. Families rationed it, traded it, and sometimes even hid it from neighbors. A single cow meant power. A full pail meant leverage. But in normal times, milk remained an unstable companion. Delicious when fresh, dangerous when not. A comfort, a risk, a gamble poured into a clay cup and judged by sight, smell, and superstition. It was consumed quietly without toasts or ceremony. It did not have the joy of wine, the tradition of ale, or the clarity of water. But it was familiar. And for those who managed to store it, stretch it, or turn it into something safer, it was enough. In the medieval world, few drinks were truly safe. Fewer still were sacred. Milk, strangely, managed to be both, fragile and vital, fleeting and essential. It spoiled easily, but so did everything. It nourished the young, the old, and the tired, and though it rarely made the poems or the parchments, it lingered at every hearth and behind every door, because in a time when drinking water meant flirting with disease, a warm mug of milk, curdled or not, still felt like something close to home. Steam rises from a battered clay cup. It smells faintly of nettle, maybe mint, possibly something stronger. A cluster of dried leaves floats lazily on the surface. There is no label, no recipe, no brand. Just the quiet comfort of a herbal brew made in a cottage kitchen, stirred by hand, whispered over, and consumed with cautious hope. In the medieval world, herbs were not seasoning. They were medicine, magic, and myth. And sometimes they were hydration. When ale was too expensive and wine was out of reach, when milk had spoiled and the well seemed cursed, people turned to plants. They gathered them in forests, grew them in gardens, tied them in bundles, and soaked them in water. These were the tisanes, infusions, and odd concoctions that filled the gaps between real drinks. They went by many names and had many effects, some calming, some invigorating, some dangerous. But above all, they were made with intention: a tea of chamomile to ease nerves, a nettle infusion to cleanse the blood, a brew of elderflower to break a fever. These were not beverages, they were tools. Herbal drinks were particularly common among women. Mothers, midwives, and healers guarded recipes the way monks guarded manuscripts. A specific blend of herbs might be known to help with childbirth pains, another to stop coughing. Children were dosed with warm brews to calm their stomachs or hush their cries. Old women handed down secrets about which herbs required boiling, which needed only steeping, and which should never be mixed without a protective prayer. Because these herbal drinks were often made at home, they varied widely in composition. One family's headache remedy might cause hallucinations in another household. One village's calming tea might be banned entirely in the next town. The ingredients were whatever grew nearby: lavender, thyme, sage, yarrow, fennel, mugwort. If it had a scent and did not kill the chickens, someone probably steeped it. Historians still argue whether most people truly believed in the medicinal properties of these drinks, or whether it was simply something to do when options were limited. Either way, the rituals surrounding herbal infusions gave people a sense of control. When illness loomed or water tasted wrong, it helped to feel that one could brew something purposeful. Whether or not the herb actually helped, the act of preparing it did. Some tisanes were social. Visitors might be offered a warm mug of rosemary or lemon balm. In colder climates, mulled brews with cinnamon or cloves became winter staples. These spices were expensive and often reserved for holidays, but when added to a pot of boiling herbs, they created a powerful illusion of wealth and comfort. Even if the liquid beneath was mostly boiled weeds, the smell alone could lift spirits. Other brews were ceremonial. Some were prepared during births or funerals, with strict instructions about who could stir the pot or pour the first cup. A particular blend might be reserved for weddings, shared only between the bride and groom. A stronger, bitter infusion might be used in curses or blessings, depending on the intent. Monasteries also embraced herbal infusions, particularly in infirmaries. Monks grew rows of medicinal plants in their cloister gardens: plantain for wounds, valerian for sleep, horehound for coughs. Recipes were recorded in herbal manuscripts, passed down and copied with ornate flourishes. Some were surprisingly effective, others were more faith than function. One fringe belief held that speaking a prayer while stirring the herbs clockwise increased their potency. Another insisted that infusions made under a full moon worked faster. There were instructions about water temperature, time of day, and even the mood of the person brewing. Whether these factors made a difference is unknown, but the belief itself gave weight to the process. There were also cautionary tales. Some herbs could poison as easily as they could heal. Hemlock, belladonna, and foxglove found their way into the wrong cups more than once. Children sometimes drank what they should not. Adults misread recipes or confused similar-looking plants. The consequences could be mild, a headache, a rash, or fatal. It was a risk everyone accepted. Because the ingredients were not consistent, the effects of these brews varied from house to house and cup to cup. One person's remedy was another's mistake. Some families kept herbal knowledge within their lineage, refusing to share recipes except under oath or in exchange for favors. Others offered their brews freely, leaving bundles of dried herbs on neighbors' doorsteps or offering cups to travelers in need. In towns, market stalls sold sachets of dried herbs. The sellers, often older women with wide skirts and sharp eyes, claimed their blends cured everything from fevers to bad dreams. Authorities occasionally accused them of witchcraft, especially if a brew worked suspiciously well. A woman who cured too many ailments with nothing but leaves and steam might find herself watched closely. Healing was valuable. Too much healing was dangerous. Some people drank herbal brews for clarity. Monks prepared drinks before long nights of copying texts. Soldiers drank warming infusions before battle. A tired craftsman might sip something pungent and bitter to shake off sleep. Even students, few as they were, had preferred teas for memory and focus, often mint or rosemary. Children were not excluded. They drank mild brews to calm their stomachs, settle fevers, or help them sleep. Some mothers made daily teas to keep their children strong, simple blends of chamomile and honey or thyme and lemon. The taste was not always pleasant, but the warmth of the cup, the gentleness of the ritual, carried comfort that water never could. In some villages, herbal brews became part of seasonal celebrations. A spring drink brewed from fresh dandelions, an autumn infusion of sage and apple peel, a solstice blend with every herb gathered that year, stirred together in one chaotic, potent potion. These drinks were not sold, not stored. They were shared, hot and fleeting, like the seasons they marked. During times of scarcity, herbal brews became even more important. When ale ran out and wine was unaffordable, when the cow gave no milk and the well was green with slime, people turned to what still grew. A handful of mint, a sprig of yarrow, leaves from a tree that survived the frost. These became survival drinks, not glamorous, not intoxicating, but enough to push through another day. Not all herbal drinks were taken by mouth. Some were poured over wounds. Others were used in bathing rituals: lavender water for skin ailments, rosemary to ease sore muscles, elderflower to cool fevers. These applications blurred the line between washing and drinking. the same plants that steeped in a cup could just as easily float in a wooden tub. Travelers often carried pouches of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. These served as quick remedies and protective talismans. When sleeping in unfamiliar barns or under hedgerows, a person might chew a clove or sip a bitter blend to ward off illness. Whether or not the herbs had the power people believed, the presence of the pouch itself offered reassurance. There were stories too, tales of brews that helped women see into the future, of herbs that forced the truth out of liars, of leaves so potent that a single sip revealed past lives. These stories were usually told at night near the fire, between sips of something steaming and sour. Even those who laughed at them often kept a secret recipe tucked away. Herbal drinks also served as a kind of social currency. A woman known for her sleep tea might receive gifts all winter. A man with the best headache blend might find extra eggs in his basket. The drinks connected people. They were favors, apologies, bribes, and offerings, not just hydration, but hospitality in its purest, most personal form. Sometimes the herbs ran out, a bad harvest, a harsh frost. And then people stretched what they had, reusing steeped leaves, drying stalks that were normally discarded, adding wood shavings or bark. So these brews were weaker, sometimes nearly tasteless. But even a ghost of a flavor could bring comfort. And always, the process mattered more than the product. Water was risky. Wine was costly. Ale was labor. Butt and herb, picked by hand, dried in the rafters, crushed in a mortar, felt personal. The act of turning it into a drink was its own kind of magic. Boil, steep, pour, breathe. In a world full of uncertainty, a simple cup of herbal tea was a quiet assertion of agency. No priests, no guilds, no taxes, just fire, water, and leaves. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, a cup of something warm, made from plants, patience, and a little whispered hope, could make all the difference. The smell is different in the countryside, not just because of livestock or open fields, but because the water smells different. Or rather, it often does not smell at all, which in medieval terms is a victory. In rural areas, water sources could be cleaner, deeper, and less shared with neighbors who dumped things best left undescribed. The divide between urban and rural water safety was real. In cities, rivers doubled as sewers. Wells were crowded by outhouses and dye pits. People drew from the same stream they dumped refuse into the previous day. In villages, streams ran clearer, if not entirely pure, and families knew exactly who used the upstream bend. That does not mean countryside living was a sanitary dream. It simply meant the contamination was easier to track. If a sheep fell into the spring, the village found out. If a neighbor started using a bucket to wash something unsavory, there were words. But the population density was lower, the earth was more forgiving, and people could adapt their drinking habits more easily. Rural households often managed their own water. Some built small covered wells. Others drew water from springs nestled between hills. Many homes stored rainwater in barrels, carefully covered with cloth or wooden lids to keep out insects and animals. It was not ideal. It turned stale. Algae formed. But it was still better than sharing a municipal trough with 20 apprentices and a dead pigeon. In cities, the solutions were more desperate. Large towns tried to manage water through public fountains or aqueducts, many inherited from Roman engineering. But pipes cracked, cisterns overflowed, and fountains collected grime from 100 hands. Water sellers filled jugs from wherever they could and shouted their wares in crowded markets. No one asked where the water came from. Everyone knew the answer would ruin the thirst. Historians still argue whether urban dwellers knew their water was more dangerous or simply had fewer options. Likely, it was both. Boiling water was labor-intensive. Ale cost money. Herbal brews took time. In cities where everyone was busy staying alive, People made do with what they had and avoided thinking about what floated in the bottom of the bucket. One fringe practice in both town and country was water whispering. People talked to wells, literally. They thanked them for clean water. They apologized when someone became ill. They dropped coins or herbs into the depths. A few families believed a specific spirit lived in their well and left bread or milk at its edge. Some of these customs lasted for centuries. Whether the well was cleaner afterward is debatable. Whether people felt better about drinking from it is not. Rural households, especially those without livestock, often relied more heavily on seasonal water. Rain collection was vital during spring and fall. Snowmelt fed streams in early summer. During dry spells, people shared sources or walked long distances with wooden pails swinging from tired arms. In some villages, children were sent out every morning to collect water, and the choice of stream or spring became part of daily strategy. In urban settings, water access depended on status. Wealthier homes had private wells, often covered and guarded. Some even installed basic filtering systems using gravel and charcoal. These were primitive but not useless. At the very least, they removed visible debris. For the poor, water came from shared sources, often closer to cesspits than comfort. Illness spread fast. Gossip spread faster. The physical act of carrying water shaped daily life. In both settings, water had to be fetched, lifted, stored, and ladled out sparingly. No one ran a tap. Every drop came with effort. It was measured. It was watched. Children learned early not to waste it. Spilling a bucket meant more than inconvenience. It meant losing precious time and possibly drinking something worse later. Some households designated one container for drinking water only. It was cleaned more often. It was covered more carefully. In some homes, it was placed in a central location and watched over like a shrine. Water was not just a necessity, it was a resource, one that required vigilance. Differences in storage also widened the gap between town and country. In rural homes, barrels were often made from oak or ash, lined with pitch or resin to prevent leaks. These barrels kept water cooler and somewhat fresher. In towns, pottery jugs or lead-lined cisterns were common. The former broke, the latter poisoned, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to cause problems no one knew how to diagnose. The irony of medieval urban water was that the very infrastructure that made cities possible often made water worse. Drains clogged, gutters overflowed, streets turned into shallow rivers of filth during storms. Any clean water moving through town picked up company before reaching the cup. And once it did, no one trusted it fully. Because of this, many people drank liquids that had passed through something else first. Barley, grapes, leaves, cows. Even in villages where the streams sparkled, there was hesitation. One dead frog ruined a season. One outbreak changed habits forever. Water testing, such as it existed, relied on animals. If the dog drank it and lived, it was declared safe. If the chickens avoided it, there were whispers. Some families placed silver coins in water jugs, believing they killed poisons. There is some truth in silver's antimicrobial properties, but the medieval application was more hopeful than scientific. In towns, suspicion ran deeper. If a household fell ill, neighbors blamed the well, or the maid, or the merchant who sold them vinegar 2 weeks ago. Water contamination was rarely acknowledged directly. It was too abstract, too invisible, easier to blame something with a face. In rural communities, cause and effect felt closer. If someone fell ill, others looked upstream. They asked questions. They adjusted. The water might still be dangerous, but at least the danger felt knowable. One peculiar practice involved blessing water sources during feast days. Priests gathered villagers by the well, sprinkled holy water into the depths, and said prayers for purity. This was less about chemistry and more about comfort. Afterward, people said the water tasted sweeter. It probably did not. But belief was powerful. Urban centres often ignored such rituals. The water was already political, managed by guilds, taxed by lords, accessed by favour. People argued over rights to the fountain or the order of drawing. Disputes were common, fights broke out. A person might wait in line for an hour, only to see the water run cloudy and the sun go down. Then it was back to ale. In the countryside, water politics was simpler, but no less emotional. A neighbour who drew more than his share might face quiet retaliation. A disputed spring could split a village. And if someone poisoned a well intentionally or by negligence, the consequences were often harsh: fines, banishment, or worse. Water justice was swift. Despite all of this, people adapted. They learned which streams ran clean after rain. They tracked seasonal changes. They remembered which wells produced sulfur smells in August and which stayed cold through July. This knowledge passed through families like heirlooms, not written, not recorded, but trusted. Some towns attempted innovation. Public bathhouses and fountains tried to normalize cleanliness, but these often failed, not because the ideas were bad, but because the maintenance was impossible. Pipes cracked, roofs collapsed, water pressure dropped. The promise of cleanliness faded beneath the weight of grime and human error. And so the divide remained. Country water might be clearer, but it was more fragile. City water might be accessible, but it was more corrupt. In both places, people searched for better options, leaned on tradition, and drank what they had with cautious optimism. Because in the medieval world, every sip was a calculation, every ladle was a wager, and no one, no matter how rich or careful, escaped the truth. Clean water was rare. Trust was even rarer. But thirst was constant. And so the choices continued. Barrels filled, buckets emptied, springs whispered to beneath the trees. Somewhere between cracked cobblestones and a flickering torch, a child scratches at the back of his ankle. Again and again. The cause is simple. He has not worn socks in weeks, possibly ever. His feet sweat inside rough leather shoes, and the dampness has invited a familiar collection of fungal guests. Welcome to medieval foot care, or rather, the curious absence of it. Hygiene in the medieval period was not entirely ignored. People did wash. They did notice bad smells. They cared, often deeply, about personal presentation. But when it came to feet, there was a strange mixture of avoidance, improvisation, and enduring discomfort. Clean feet were a luxury. Dry feet were a miracle. Water, as has been established, was a gamble. Soaking one's feet in it invited risk. Washing them was often done with leftover broth or beer dregs, whatever could spare a little warmth and not smell worse than the problem itself. In wealthier homes, footbaths existed. Servants brought warm water, herbs, and linen towels. But even then, the practice was more about ritual than effectiveness. A splash, a scrub, and back into the boots. In rural areas, people went barefoot often, especially children. Shoes wore out quickly, and most households owned one or two pairs at most. Feet grew tough, calluses served as armor, cuts healed slowly, and infections spread faster than rumors at market. Still, feet remained largely neglected unless they caused real pain. It was common for people to sleep with their feet near the fire, not for comfort, but to dry them. Moisture was the enemy. Blisters became ulcers. Ulcers turned into something worse. People stuffed their shoes with straw, rags, or nothing at all. In cold months, they wrapped their feet in cloth, sometimes wool, sometimes whatever they could find. Socks, in the modern sense, were rare and expensive. Historians still argue whether foot infections were seen as a normal part of life or a sign of divine punishment. Some religious texts speak of sores and lesions as tests of faith. Others suggest that pilgrims developed foot ailments as a badge of suffering. Either way, there was little structured care. A poultice of garlic and wine might be applied, a prayer might be said. But unless a person could no longer walk, the issue remained their own. One fringe remedy involved burying one's feet in warm manure. It was said to draw out illness and ease joint pain. The science is questionable, the smell is not. Another method required soaking the feet in vinegar, then wrapping them in strips of old linen soaked in rose water. A luxury, clearly, and one reserved for those who could afford both vinegar and rose petals in the same week. Shoes varied. The rich wore leather, sometimes lined with fur. The poor made do with wooden clogs, scraps of hide, or went without. Footwear was not standardized. There were no sizes. People wore what fit well enough. Ill-fitting shoes caused blisters. Blisters became blood blisters, and when shoes were shared between siblings or borrowed from neighbors, the resulting foot ailments were treated with vague regret. Nails were not trimmed often. When they grew too long or painful, they were snapped off or filed with bits of rough stone. Ingrown toenails were addressed with knives, small ones ideally, but not always sterile or sharp. The pain was tolerated. The outcome was not guaranteed. Public bathhouses occasionally included foot washing stations, but again, these were not designed with fungi in mind. They offered warm water, communal benches, and the soothing illusion of cleanliness. However, these spaces also bred infections of their own. People shared towels, basins, and floors. Athlete's foot was likely not called that, but it certainly made the rounds. In monasteries, monks often washed each other's feet as a symbolic gesture. It echoed biblical stories of humility and service. The water was warmed, the process was quiet, and for a moment someone's feet were clean, at least until they stepped outside again. This practice was more spiritual than sanitary, but it left behind written records and illustrations, reminders that even the most overlooked body part could carry meaning. Travelers faced particular challenges. Long walks in wet boots led to trench-like rot. Soldiers rubbed their feet with animal fat to create a barrier against water. Shepherds packed moss into their shoes. Some used lard. Others relied on strong-smelling herbs, both to mask odor and to fight infection. It worked sometimes, but not often enough. Women, when not barefoot, wore soft slippers indoors. These were rarely practical and offered little protection. Dancers and servants alike suffered from blisters and splits. Pregnant women were sometimes advised to soak their feet in cool water to balance the womb. The logic was unclear, the results mixed. One curious practice was walking barefoot through morning dew. It was believed to cure joint stiffness and soothe fevers. In some villages, this was done as part of religious festivals or healing rituals. The dew was thought to carry nature's purity. More likely, it was simply cold enough to numb the pain for a few minutes. There were also charms. Some people tied small bags of herbs to their ankles to protect their feet from spirits. Others etched protective symbols into the soles of their shoes. In regions where witchcraft fears ran high, a sore foot could be blamed on a neighbor's evil eye. A person might wake to find scratches or swelling and decide they had been cursed. Remedies included ash circles, iron pins, or carrying dried toads. It is unclear whether these helped the feet, but they certainly made conversation more interesting. During winter, frostbite was common. Toes turned black, then numb, then vanished. People wrapped their feet in sheepskin or placed them near the hearth for hours. Some burned themselves trying to restore circulation. A few believed that rubbing snow into frozen feet would help. It did not, but it distracted from the pain. The role of shoes in class identity cannot be overstated. Nobles wore pointed shoes, sometimes so long they had to be tied up with ribbons. These shoes were useless for walking, but very effective for showing off wealth. Poor people wore flat shoes, plain and functional. A good pair might last 2 seasons, a bad one, 2 weeks. Cobblers did what they could. They patched soles with scrap leather, replaced ties hammered in iron nails, but even they had limits. Shoes were not mass-produced. Every pair was unique, every foot equally so. And not all cobblers were skilled. A badly repaired shoe could cause more harm than going barefoot. Foot ailments were so widespread that people developed a surprising tolerance for discomfort. A limp was not suspicious, it was expected. An odd gait, a dragging foot, or the inability to bend one's toes was rarely remarked upon unless it interfered with work. Feet were not aesthetic objects, they were tools. If they worked, even poorly, they were considered acceptable. Children learned early to care for their feet in rough ways. They scraped mud off with sticks. They soaked in cold puddles. They picked at blisters until they bled, then wrapped them in wool. If the wound festered, someone might apply honey or chewed bread. If it healed, the child limped for a week and then forgot the lesson. Some festivals included foot races, not for health, but for sport. Participants often ran barefoot through uneven fields, dodging stones and thorns. Prizes ranged from loaves of bread to ribbons. The aftermath often included bandaged toes and a few missing nails. It was still considered worth it. In some towns, local healers specialized in feet, though not officially. They were known more by word of mouth than by signage. An old man with a file, a young woman with a copper kettle, a widow who whispered over bunions. They treated what they could, and when they could not, they offered strong ale. There were also those who ignored foot problems entirely. The pain was constant. It did not spike or scream. It simply remained, a dull throb, a burning itch, a raw edge. People grew accustomed to it, a minor discomfort in a world full of larger ones. But on cold mornings with frost creeping across the floor, feet mattered. They were what touched the world first. They stepped into boots, into chores, into survival. If they cracked, bled, or swelled, the day slowed down. Pain became drag, and drag became danger. No one held ceremonies for foot care. No one wrote songs. But there was reverence in the way a person eased into warm straw, in how they curled their toes near a hearthstone or pressed dry cloth against their soles after a storm. A private ritual, a quiet gratitude. Because in a world where feet were both transportation and foundation, they were precious in the most neglected sense. The outhouse door creaks open, assuming there is a door. More often, it is a crude wooden frame, angled just enough to offer the illusion of privacy. Inside, there is no toilet paper, no seat, no flush, just a hole, a smell, and a decision to be made quickly. Going to the toilet in the medieval world was less a routine and more a negotiation with one's own dignity. Human waste, by its very nature, must go somewhere. In the medieval period, the options were limited. There were chamber pots, latrines, cesspits, ditches, and rivers. None were ideal, all carried risks. But they existed, scattered across towns, monasteries, castles, and villages, each with its own quirks, hazards, and peculiar customs. In towns, most people relieved themselves in chamber pots, especially at night. These were emptied into the street or into a designated waste area. The morning ritual in many neighborhoods included dodging whatever had been tossed from upper windows. The phrase "gardy-loo," a warning shout used in some places, was meant to alert those below. Whether it was heeded in time is another matter. Castles had slightly more sophisticated setups. Some featured garderobes, small stone rooms with chutes that carried waste down the outer wall. Theoretically, it dropped into the moat. In practice, it smeared the wall and collected below in foul, sticky piles. Servants were tasked with cleaning these. No one envied them. Some garderobes were positioned over rainwater drains. This made them cleaner in theory, but the smell persisted. Monasteries handled the problem with slightly more organization. Large latrines were built over running water channels. Waste was washed away, at least partially. Monks followed strict rules about when and how to relieve themselves. Silence was often maintained, even in the latrine. It was a solemn, quiet affair. and while it may sound orderly, the reality remained deeply unpleasant. Historians still argue whether medieval people considered the sanitation implications of their choices. Some evidence suggests they did. Privies were sometimes placed far from wells. Laws prohibited dumping waste into certain streams, but enforcement was inconsistent, and understanding of contamination remained vague. The nose knew something was wrong. Science had not yet arrived to explain it. In rural areas, the practice was simpler and sometimes more sanitary. People used the edge of the forest or a designated spot behind the barn. The soil absorbed more than the cobblestones of a town. Waste broke down more easily. There was privacy in nature, though not always comfort. Brambles, insects, and freezing winds made for memorable visits. The poor often lacked permanent facilities. A family might dig a shallow pit and cover it periodically with dirt. When it filled, they moved and dug another. Some shared pits with neighbors, others simply found a discreet spot and hoped for rain. This was common in overcrowded slums where space, resources, and privacy were all luxuries. Wealthier households owned wooden commodes or porcelain chamber pots. Some were decorated absurdly with floral motifs or painted scenes. These were often emptied by servants or apprentices, yet another reminder that class could insulate one from the less charming aspects of daily life. There were regional variations in terminology and technique. Some communities developed elaborate outhouses with ventilation slits and scented herbs tucked into the walls. Others preferred open-air setups. The choices often reflected local climate, resources, and customs more than any overarching principle of hygiene. One fringe practice involved the use of moss, wool scraps, or even seashells for wiping. The idea of toilet paper, as it exists today, did not yet exist. People used whatever was available. Some used smooth sticks or handfuls of straw. In wealthier homes, linen rags might be reserved for this purpose and washed afterwards, by someone low on the social ladder, of course. Waste was also repurposed. Human waste, known as night soil, was sometimes collected and sold to farmers as fertilizer. This was dangerous but economically efficient. People accepted the risks. Some towns employed workers whose sole task was to empty cesspits and cart away the contents. These workers were called gong farmers in England. Their job was essential and revolting. They worked at night, wore thick boots, and were paid surprisingly well, perhaps as compensation for the loss of smell and dignity. Gong farmers were often isolated socially. Their work was seen as unclean, both physically and spiritually. Some communities forbade them from participating in certain rituals. Others respected them quietly, knowing full well what the town would look like without them. Toilets, such as they were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Lime might be sprinkled to suppress odor. Ashes from the hearth could be dumped to reduce moisture. But the accumulation was constant. Maggots, rats, and disease followed closely behind. People adapted by covering their noses, moving quickly, and pretending not to notice. During festivals or large gatherings, sanitation often collapsed entirely. Ale flowed freely, so did everything else. Temporary pits were dug. Some were used, some not. It was common for people to relieve themselves wherever they stood, especially after dark. The aftermath was unfortunate for morning travelers. Children learned early how to navigate the system. They were often assigned the task of emptying pots or fetching ash. They learned to hold their noses, move fast, and keep complaints to themselves. It was a rite of passage, albeit one no one looked forward to. Women faced additional challenges. Privacy was harder to come by. Long skirts helped, but modesty laws and social pressure meant many women waited uncomfortably long or used less than safe locations. Some developed discreet routines involving screens, curtains, or the cooperation of others. Men, more often outdoors, faced fewer restrictions. In towns, alleyways became unofficial urinals. In castles, soldiers relieved themselves near battlements. In villages, a tree or wall sufficed. This disparity shaped experiences, routines, and health outcomes across genders. The dangers of medieval sanitation were immense. Cholera, dysentery, and parasitic infections were common. Flies spread filth from one location to another. Wells became poisoned by nearby cesspits. Yet, in the absence of germ theory, blame was assigned to miasmas, bad air, or moral failings. Illness was often seen as divine punishment rather than bacterial inevitability. There were attempts at regulation. Town ordinances forbade waste dumping in main thoroughfares. Fines were issued to those caught soiling fountains or polluting water channels. But enforcement varied. And even in well-run towns, the sheer volume of waste made total control impossible. Certain buildings included multi-seat latrines, especially in monasteries or larger estates. These were communal, and conversations sometimes took place during use. It was not considered strange. Modesty, in this case, gave way to routine. The smell lingered, but so did the social function. Some cultures built overhanging toilets on bridges. Waste dropped directly into the river. This was efficient, but disastrous for those living downstream. Travelers were warned to avoid drinking water near cities for precisely this reason. The connection between human waste and agriculture also shaped attitudes. Fertilizer was precious. Crop yields depended on nutrients. In some cases, farmers requested waste deliveries. It was scooped, transported, and applied by hand. Gloves were rare, sickness common. The psychological toll of medieval toilets is difficult to quantify. Constant exposure to filth shaped expectations. People accepted odors, stains, and illness as background features of life. Complaints were rare. Endurance prized. Some scholars speculate that religious obsession with purity may have been a response to daily filth. Rituals of cleansing, fasting, and penance reflected a yearning for order in a world that constantly produced the opposite. Bodily functions were reminders of mortality, weakness, and the inescapable physicality of life. Still, laughter persisted. Jokes about toilets appear in plays, poems, and sermons. Everyone shared the experience, from the lowest laborer to the king. Flatulence jokes crossed class lines. Outhouse mishaps became stories told at night. There was unity in discomfort. Because in the medieval world, going to the toilet was not a matter of privacy or luxury. It was a dance with nature, space, and custom. It was an act performed with speed, caution, and low expectations. And afterward, with a sniff, a shrug, and a few shuffled steps, people carried on. In the far corner of a dimly lit workshop, a thin man leans over a bubbling pot. Steam rises thick with sweetness. A wooden paddle scrapes the edge. This is not a potion or a stew. It is mead, honey wine, and in the medieval imagination, it hovers somewhere between indulgence and medicine. Mead was old, even by medieval standards. People drank it long before the first cathedrals rose, before the first guild charters were inked. It came from beekeepers and warriors, monks and mystics. It required only honey, water, and fermentation time. Simpler than ale, richer than wine, and endlessly flexible, mead sat slightly apart from other medieval drinks. It was rare, it was revered, and, when available, it was consumed with both celebration and suspicion. Honey was expensive. Bees had to be tended carefully, their hives placed away from damp and protected from theft. Swarming season required attention. Harvesting honey meant enduring stings, climbing trees, and using smoke. Every drop was precious, which made mead a drink of choice for the well-off or, for very special occasions, among the poor. In some regions, mead was brewed only once or twice a year. It was sealed in earthenware or wooden casks and stored in cool cellars. When opened, it foamed gently and smelled of clover, wild herbs, and damp wood. The strength varied wildly. Some batches barely caused a blush, while others sent a grown man to sleep with his shoes still on. Historians still debate whether mead was truly as widespread as the legends claim. Some argue that it was reserved for elites and religious ceremonies. Others insist that it was a common peasant drink in regions where grapes were scarce and barley did not grow well. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. What is certain is that mead carried cultural weight. In Norse tradition, it was the drink of gods and poets. Skalds drank mead before reciting epics. Warriors drank it after battle. In Anglo-Saxon texts, mead halls were central to community life. The drink itself symbolized unity, memory, and glory. Even centuries later, the echoes remained. Medieval people flavored mead with spices, herbs, and fruits. Cloves, ginger, elderberries, cinnamon. These were added not only for taste, but for their perceived healing properties. A cup of mead was believed to aid digestion, soothe grief, or inspire romance. Whether or not it worked, no one denied that it made evenings warmer and conversations more generous. One fringe recipe included crushed oyster shells, believed to enhance virility. Another instructed the brewer to sing to the mead each evening during fermentation. In both cases, the effect was more spiritual than chemical, but the ritual mattered. The act of making mead became as meaningful as drinking it. Monasteries occasionally produced mead, though less frequently than ale. Honey was harder to come by in bulk, but when they did, the resulting batches were often used medicinally. Mead was given to the sick, the dying, or visiting nobles. Infirmaries stocked small flasks. Priors offered it during cold seasons. It was kept locked, guarded not just against theft, but against casual indulgence. Mead also appeared in marriage traditions. A newlywed couple might be given enough mead to last a full moon cycle, 30 days, hence the term honeymoon. The idea was that the drink would encourage fertility and harmony. Whether it delivered on those promises remains an open question. But the tradition lingered and in some regions persists even now. In taverns, mead was less common than ale, but not unknown. It was usually more expensive and served in smaller cups. Some tavern keepers blended it with ale or cider to stretch supplies. Others passed off sweetened ale as mead. Customers knew the difference, or pretended not to. Because honey was a product of the land, mead changed from village to village. The taste of one beekeeper's mead might differ entirely from another's just a mile away. Soil, flowers, weather, all shaped the outcome. Some meads were light and floral, others dark and heavy. Some fizzed, some did not. A person could become attached to a particular batch, the way one becomes attached to a season. Making mead at home required patience. The fermentation process was slow. It could take weeks or months. A failed batch meant wasted honey, no small loss. Families who succeeded kept their methods private. Some recipes were passed down like heirlooms guarded with quiet pride. In times of sickness, mead was offered to the weak. Warmed gently, mixed with a pinch of sage or lemon balm, it was said to restore strength. For the grieving, it dulled the edges of sorrow. For the anxious, it eased nerves, and for the cold, it brought a soft inner fire that ale rarely delivered. Not everyone trusted it. Some believed mead invited dreams, visions, or even possession. A few clerics warned against its use in excess, claiming that it stirred unnatural passions. Whether that was due to the alcohol or the honey, no one agreed. But the warnings were clear. Mead could elevate or undo a person depending on how they approached it. Weddings, solstice feasts, and birth celebrations often included mead if it could be obtained. A single shared cup might be passed around the room. Guests sipped, then nodded silently. It was not about intoxication, it was about participation. To drink the mead was to join the moment fully. Some regions developed spiced meads known as metheglins. These were intentionally medicinal and often included dozens of herbs. Recipes varied but might include rosemary, thyme, wormwood, or even pepper. They were rarely enjoyable in flavor, but they carried weight. A grandmother's metheglin might be credited with saving lives or clearing lungs. Whether it did or not was beside the point. Mead was not stored in glass. It lived in barrels, crocks, or wax-sealed flasks. The storage itself influenced taste. Oak casks gave it depth. Clay pots kept it cool. Some brewers added beeswax to soften the flavor. Others used birch bark, believing it infused clarity. In regions without grapes, mead sometimes replaced wine in religious rituals. Not officially, of course, but quietly in remote chapels, a priest might bless a cup of mead rather than sour wine from a foreign barrel. This substitution raised eyebrows but rarely reached authorities. Mead also appeared in folklore. It was the drink of fairies, elves, or spirits in many stories. A lost traveller offered a golden cup of mead was wise to refuse, lest he wake 100 years later, or worse, never at all. These stories reflected both the drink's allure and its danger. Despite its occasional rarity, mead retained a strong identity. It did not fade as quickly as other drinks. It lingered in poetry, proverbs, and memory. Even as beer became dominant, mead held on, part sweet indulgence, part sacred tradition. Because in a world full of bitter brews, dangerous water, and bland survival, mead was something different. It was deliberate. It was golden. It shimmered slightly in the light and clung to the lips. And whether brewed in a monk's cellar, a beekeeper's barn, or a thatched kitchen beside the hills, it offered the same quiet promise. A brief sweetness in the mouth, a softness behind the eyes, and the sense that for just a moment the world might be kind. In the center of a bustling medieval town square, a man sells vinegar from a wooden cart. Small casks, sealed with wax and marked with crude symbols, rest beside jars of pickled onions and cloudy bottles of what might be medicine or might be soup. It is difficult to tell. What is certain, though, is that vinegar was everywhere and people drank it, willingly, sometimes even joyfully. Vinegar in the medieval world was not just a kitchen ingredient. It was a preservative, a cleanser, a tonic, a cooking staple, and, yes, occasionally, a drink. It was sour, strong, and occasionally dangerous, and it played a surprising role in how people stayed hydrated, or at least how they convinced themselves they were doing so. Vinegar forms naturally when wine or ale spoils in the right conditions. Yeast gives way to acetic acid bacteria, and what was once festive becomes pungent. In most cases, this was considered a failure, but in a world where nearly every liquid spoiled eventually, vinegar was viewed as salvage. It was what came after the wine had grown tired. It was what ale became when neglected. It was a second chance in a barrel. This second chance was often embraced. Vinegar was mixed with water to create a drink known in various regions as posca, or sour wine water. It was especially common among soldiers and laborers. The idea was simple. Water was dangerous, but vinegar could help kill whatever lingered in it. The sharpness also masked unpleasant flavors. And, perhaps most importantly, it offered the illusion of refreshment. Historians still debate whether vinegar truly neutralized harmful microbes or simply made foul water more palatable. The acidic environment could deter some bacteria, but the overall effectiveness remains unclear. What is clear, however, is that people believed it helped, and belief often carried as much weight as science in those times. Roman soldiers were known to drink posca centuries earlier, and the tradition never quite vanished. In medieval times, the drink was passed down through military camps, monasteries, and farming communities. It was easy to make, easy to store, and, in small quantities, vaguely revitalizing. One fringe belief held that drinking vinegar sharpened the mind. Students were occasionally encouraged to sip it before long reading sessions. Others claimed it calmed the heart or suppressed lustful thoughts. Whether it truly had these effects is uncertain, but it certainly stopped people from overindulging. No one drank too much vinegar. It was self-regulating in that way. Some brewers created flavored vinegar drinks. These included honey, herbs, or even bits of fruit. The resulting concoctions were known as oxymels, sweet-sour tonics used as health remedies. They were taken in small sips, usually from clay cups, and prescribed for ailments ranging from sore throats to melancholia. A splash of oxymel before sleep was believed to prevent bad dreams, or, at the very least, to keep the stomach occupied with something more interesting than ghosts. In the kitchen, vinegar served as a seasoning. It brought brightness to otherwise bland dishes. It was added to stews, lentils, preserved vegetables, and even cheese. But sometimes, when all else failed, when the water was green, the ale was flat, and the wine had vanished, people simply drank it. Vinegar diluted in water became a common mealtime drink for the poor. It was cheap, easy to transport, and hard to ruin further. A traveler could carry a flask of vinegar and add it to questionable water as needed. It did not taste good, but it tasted intentional, which, in some cases, was enough. In monasteries, vinegar had multiple uses. It was used to clean wounds, rinse hands, freshen stale bread, and even mop floors. Some monks believed vinegar's sharpness warded off evil spirits. Others just appreciated its smell over other options. Not all vinegar was equal. Apple cider vinegar was popular in orchards and cooler regions. Wine vinegar was stronger, more acidic, and often reserved for the wealthy or the particularly brave. Ale vinegar had a more musty aroma and was often used in cooking rather than drinking. Balsamic vinegar, as it would later be known, existed in infancy in parts of Italy, but was largely unknown elsewhere. Some households maintained a vinegar mother, a strange, gelatinous mass that grew inside barrels and helped ferment new batches. These mothers were treasured and passed down. They looked unpleasant, but functioned reliably. To lose one was to lose a source of preservation, flavor, and drink. Some were even named. People whispered to them as one might a pet or a garden. One fringe recipe advised placing a piece of iron in the vinegar barrel to harden the courage of anyone who drank from it. Another suggested adding crushed pearls to give the drink noble energy. Whether these additions improved the taste is doubtful. They certainly made the drink more expensive. Vinegar drinks also featured in religious practices. Some fasts allowed vinegar water mixtures when all other drinks were forbidden. The sourness was considered humbling. It reminded the drinker of sacrifice, simplicity, and the bitterness of the world. In some cases, vinegar was taken by monks as penance, its sharpness symbolic of discipline. During plague outbreaks, vinegar was mixed with herbs and carried in flasks. People dabbed it on their skin, soaked handkerchiefs in it, and sniffed it constantly. It was thought to purify the air and keep disease at bay. Whether it did anything meaningful is uncertain, but it gave people something to do in the face of chaos. And in some cases, that was enough. Vinegar's role in hydration may seem unthinkable today, but in a world of uncertainty, its predictability mattered. It might sting, it might burn, but it would not rot, it would not spoil, it would not grow worms. That alone made it valuable. There were, of course, consequences. Vinegar could erode teeth, upset stomachs, and irritate ulcers. Children often hated it. The elderly took it reluctantly, but it endured. In small sips it was manageable, in large ones regrettable. Either way, it was always remembered. Travelers carried vinegar in small bottles, pilgrims received vinegar water at hostels. Some guilds offered it to apprentices on hot days, believing it kept the blood thin and the temper even. It did not hydrate like clean water would have, but it hydrated better than nothing. And often, nothing was the alternative. In hot weather, vinegar water was served chilled if possible. This softened the taste slightly. Some households mixed it with snow when available to make a crude sort of slush. These drinks were offered to honored guests, not because they tasted good, but because they demonstrated effort. One curious practice involved soaking bread in vinegar, then pressing it into the forehead during fevers. This, combined with vinegar steam inhalation, was supposed to draw out the heat. It smelled atrocious. It likely had minimal effect. But it was a gesture, and gestures mattered. Children were sometimes dosed with honeyed vinegar to treat worms or coughs. They gagged, cried, and squirmed, but they usually recovered. Whether because of the vinegar or despite it remains an open question, because in the medieval world vinegar was not just a liquid, it was a solution. It was proof that something spoiled could still be useful, that what had gone sour could still serve, and that even in bitterness there was a kind of survival. And so cup after cup, diluted and grimacing, people drank it. The sun rises slowly over the fields, casting a golden sheen across rows of stalks heavy with grain. A man tightens the strap of his water gourd, knowing what sloshes inside is not water at all, but something closer to porridge. Thick, warm, and slightly fermented, it will keep him moving. Because in the medieval world, people did not just drink liquids, they drank calories. Grain-based drinks formed the backbone of hydration for much of the population. These were not merely thirst quenchers, they were sustenance. In a society where energy output was high and food security uncertain, people sought drinks that fed as well as filled. And from oat gruel to barley mash, the lines between food and drink became wonderfully, confusingly blurred. Take pottage, for instance. It was not exactly a soup, not quite a drink. It lived somewhere in the middle, depending on how much water had been added and how long it had boiled. Sometimes it was sipped, sometimes chewed, but it was often served in mugs. A traveller might pour it into a cloth-wrapped horn, drink what he could, then scrape out the rest with his fingers. Historians still argue whether these thick grain drinks should be classified as meals or beverages. In practice, they were both. Workers carried them into the fields. Children drank them for breakfast. The sick sipped them slowly. It was nourishment in its simplest form, warm, soft, mildly flavored, and dense. One common variant was oat water, made by boiling oats in a large pot, straining it loosely and drinking the cloudy liquid. It was filling, slightly sweet and easy on the stomach. Some added herbs or salt. Others left it plain. In some regions, people believed it cured digestive problems. In others, it was given to women after childbirth, believed to rebuild strength. Barley water was similar but slightly more refined. The grain was soaked, sometimes boiled, and the resulting liquid cooled and served with a bit of honey or lemon, if one were very fortunate. Monasteries prepared it for monks who had taken ill or were observing strict fasts. It was light, barely fermented, and gentle enough for the frail. In times of extreme poverty, people relied heavily on these drinks. A few handfuls of grain could create enough liquid nourishment for several family members. Though repetitive, it was better than going without. The texture was not always pleasant. It could be gritty, sour, or congealed. But it was warm, and it filled the belly. One fringe recipe involved fermenting millet and cabbage together, then drinking the frothy liquid with dried bread. It was said to be invigorating, though the smell likely discouraged second helpings. Another involved soaking beans overnight and drinking the starchy liquid the next morning, a practice praised by a few rural healers and avoided by most others. The caloric content of these drinks mattered. A person who drank ale might feel the warmth but still grow hungry. A person who drank grain mash might feel sated for hours. In labouring communities, especially during planting or harvest, these thick beverages provided essential energy. Fermentation occurred naturally. Left too long, grain-based drinks soured. Sometimes this was welcomed, creating a tart, probiotic-rich liquid. Other times it signaled that the pot had been left near the hearth too long. Either way, people still drank it. Waste was unthinkable. Children were introduced early. A toddler might be given cooled barley water in a horn cup. It was easier to digest than meat, and less risky than milk, which spoiled quickly. In some regions, families prepared a special grain brew for infants transitioning off the breast, an early form of what would later become porridge. Grain drinks were also social. Shared at morning meals or between tasks, they were served in wooden bowls or ceramic jugs. Neighbors traded batches. Recipes differed. Some were thick enough to stand a spoon in, others flowed like thin gravy. A good batch was remembered. A bad one was apologized for. Monasteries often maintained large cauldrons for these drinks. During fasting periods, broth-thin pottage served as both nourishment and symbol. It reminded monks of simplicity, sacrifice, and shared humility. On feast days, the same cauldron might produce a richer, thicker version with spices and milk. The line between austerity and abundance was, once again, a matter of consistency. In colder climates, these drinks were often consumed warm. This added comfort and minimized the risk of spoiling. A clay cup of steaming barley mash on a frosty morning could lift spirits and energy alike. Some labourers added fat scraps or marrow for richness, others added ale for flavour. It was not pretty, but it was effective. One curious practice involved letting oats ferment for several days, then bottling the froth and calling it old water. It was mildly alcoholic and widely distrusted by outsiders. But in some villages, it was tradition. A single cup might be passed around after communal work or religious processions. No one liked the taste. Everyone respected the ritual. Some medieval recipes recommended mixing grain drinks with egg yolks, especially for the sick or elderly. This created a proto-custard, drunk slowly from deep mugs. It was prescribed for faintness, melancholy, and exhaustion. Whether it helped or merely occupied the tongue is unclear, but it provided calories, and that was often enough. Storage was simple. These drinks did not last long. They soured within a day or two. Clay jars, wooden tubs, and even animal skins were used. In the absence of refrigeration, people adapted. They made small batches, they drank quickly, they shared. In regions where bread was scarce, these drinks replaced it. Where meat was rare, they stood in. A traveller might carry a flask of thick oat gruel and consider it breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Hunger adjusted expectations. Texture mattered less than fullness. Children sometimes played games with the thick dregs left in cups, drawing shapes, smearing fingers. Some mothers used the remaining sludge to thicken stews or feed animals. Nothing was wasted. The line between drink, food, and resource was blurry, but it was always respected. Even celebrations featured grain drinks. On winter solstice, some households flavored their barley water with cinnamon or dried fruits. It was festive, if not exactly delicious. But it symbolized care, effort, the desire to mark a day as different, even if the ingredients remained the same. Among traveling laborers, these drinks were often consumed communally. A pot might be placed at the center of a resting circle, and each man would take turns sipping from the same ladle. The ritual was as much about sharing hardship as about hydration. The drink was rarely pleasant, but it was warm, and that counted for something. Women preparing these drinks often sang while stirring. Not loudly, not for show, but softly, rhythmically. Old work songs passed down in kitchens and corners. Some believed the rhythm helped the mixture settle. Others believed the song itself carried warmth into the cup. In some regions, the foam that rose to the top of fermented oat water was scooped off and given to children as a treat. It was airy, slightly sweet, and safe in small amounts. The foam was called grain cream in certain villages. It lasted only a few minutes before collapsing, so it had to be eaten quickly, fingers first, with sticky laughter. Elderly people with weak teeth drank grain broth as their main meal. Sometimes flavored with leeks or onion peel, it was easy to swallow and carried enough weight to quiet the belly. A thin spoonful might be all they could manage, but it was better than dry bread or cold stew. Recipes were rarely written down. A daughter learned by watching her mother's hand. How long to stir, when to skim, how much grain to measure by feel, not weight. Measurements like a fistful or until your arm tires guided the process. It made each pot unique. The smoke from these pots clung to the ceiling beams. A house that brewed often carried a permanent scent, nutty, earthy, tinged with steam and ash. Guests might know what had been made just by standing in the doorway. It was not fancy, but it was comforting, familiar, safe. Because in the medieval world, hydration had to carry more than liquid. It needed warmth. It needed weight. It needed to carry a person through toil, through hunger, through entire days of labor before the next fire crackled. And as the man in the field lifts his gourd and takes another gritty mouthful, he does not smile, but he does keep walking. The markets hum with sound. Boots on straw, roosters in crates, coins clinking across wooden tables. Somewhere in the mix, a large glass bottle shifts carefully in a wool-wrapped basket. It contains something bright, something fizzy, something sharp. Fruit vinegar soda, or as some called it, shrub. Before modern lemonade stands or soda fountains, there existed a curious family of drinks made from fruit syrup, vinegar, and water. These were not brewed in the way beer or mead were. They were concocted, measured, stirred, adjusted. And although they lacked alcohol, they had just enough tang to wake the tongue. In the hot months, they were prized, not for intoxication, but for refreshment. The base was simple: fruit, sugar, and vinegar. Raspberries, cherries, black currants, whatever grew in the hedgerows or gardens. The fruit was mashed, covered in sugar, and left to sit. After several days, the juice was strained, and vinegar was added to preserve it. The result was a concentrated syrup that could be stored in stoppered bottles and diluted with cool water whenever someone needed a drink that tasted like effort. Historians still argue whether shrubs were originally medicinal or culinary. Their acidity suggested health benefits, their sweetness suggested indulgence. Perhaps they were both. Some apothecaries stocked them, others left the recipe to household cooks. Either way, they spread across regions, changing flavor, strength, and status along the way. Shrubs could be made with honey instead of sugar, especially in earlier centuries when cane sugar was rare or expensive. Vinegars varied too. Some households used wine vinegar, others apple cider, and a few brave ones used herbal-infused blends that gave the drink a suspicious green tinge. Each variation told a story about what a family grew, preserved, and passed down. One fringe tradition involved making a shrub from rose hips and red wine vinegar, stirred counterclockwise for 7 nights while reciting a particular psalm. The resulting drink was believed to ward off fevers and nightmares. Whether this worked is unclear, but no one forgot the taste. Shrubs were especially popular among those who could not afford wine or ale in regular supply. The ingredients were accessible. They did not spoil quickly. A single bottle might last weeks. And for households without cold storage, the sharpness of the vinegar acted as a natural preservative, extending the drink's life even in warm kitchens. Children were fond of shrubs, perhaps because they mimicked grown-up drinks. The fizz from fermenting fruit gave them bubbles. the sweetness felt rare, and the ritual of mixing syrup with water, of stirring, pouring, and choosing a cup, gave children a sense of participation in something adult. A small independence, sipped slowly. In some communities, shrubs were served at gatherings or after religious ceremonies. They were not sacred exactly, but they were respectful. Refreshing without drawing attention, a quiet hospitality, a tray of clay cups, a bowl of diluted shrub, a ladle passed hand to hand. Guests did not compliment the flavor, they simply nodded, drank, and sat in silence for a few minutes longer. Shrubs made appearances in market stalls, especially during harvest seasons. A vendor might offer a taste on a reed straw or thin sliver of bread soaked in syrup. People sampled, debated, compared. The best shrubs had balance, sour, sweet, and strong. A weak shrub was whispered about. A powerful one could cause a brief coughing fit and a surprised grin. In monasteries, shrubs were sometimes served during the hottest months. Monks working in gardens or traveling on errands might receive a diluted syrup drink as part of their midday pause. It was not meant for indulgence, it was functional. But every now and then a brother might smile faintly after sipping plum shrub, and for that moment the world softened slightly. One curious use for shrubs was as a delivery system for powdered medicines. The syrup masked bitter herbs or crushed roots. Children who refused tonics would accept shrub. Adults who feared certain treatments found courage in its familiar taste. A healer might hand over a bottle with careful instructions. 1 sip before dawn, 2 after supper, none on feast days. In colder regions, shrubs were sometimes served warm. Heated gently over the fire, diluted with a bit of spiced water, they became a kind of medieval mulled soda. This variation was often used for the sick, the grieving, or those returning from long journeys. It soothed the throat and reminded people of summer flavors in the dead of winter. One fringe recipe included beet juice and pine vinegar. The result was deeply red, almost unsettling. But it was known to restore energy after long fasts, according to a few scattered records. Whether that was due to nutrition or sheer alarm is not known. The containers for shrub varied. Wealthier homes used glass bottles, sometimes imported, often reused. Poorer households relied on glazed jugs, sealed with wax and twine. The syrup had to be kept cool, dark, and undisturbed. Too much air and it spoiled. Too much light, and the color faded. In households that made shrub regularly, the preparation was almost ceremonial. Children crushed berries with smooth stones. Adults measured vinegar with finger widths. The sugar was stirred slowly, carefully, watching for the right thickness. No one rushed. A spoiled shrub was a waste. A perfect one was a minor miracle. Shrubs were not considered indulgent. They were too sharp for that. But they did feel intentional. Drinking a shrub meant someone had planned ahead. Someone had preserved fruit in anticipation of thirst. And in a world that often met need with scarcity, that felt like comfort. Travelers carried small bottles of shrub concentrate in their packs. It took up little space and could transform even foul-tasting well water into something drinkable. Some merchants kept shrub in their carts, serving it to clients as a sign of courtesy. In a few cities, taverns served shrub alongside ale, offering a non-alcoholic alternative that still felt worthy of a wooden bench and candlelight. Shrubs also found their way into rituals of courtship. A young woman might offer a homemade shrub to a suitor, carefully choosing the fruit and sweetness to suit his temperament. A rejected drink could signal disinterest. An empty cup might mean more than words. There were rumors of royal households commissioning elaborate shrub blends, spiced pear with elderflower, blackberry with cinnamon, and white wine vinegar. These were not shared with the masses, of course, but stories trickled down. A village girl might dream of a shrub so good that it would change her life, and sometimes just making it felt like enough. Some seasonal fairs hosted shrub contests. Participants brought their finest blend, carefully bottled and sealed with wax, and waited as judges sipped from silver spoons. The winner received little more than a ribbon and some claps, but their recipe might be requested for years afterward. Children would gather around hoping for a leftover taste. In some households, shrubs were poured into shallow bowls and left out for guests to serve themselves. Etiquette dictated that one should not drink too deeply, nor refill more than once unless invited. Hosts watched subtly, gauging how much people enjoyed the mix, silently making mental notes for the next batch. It was a quiet form of social choreography. Others infused their shrubs with herbs from their gardens, lavender, mint, even crushed basil. These additions were not common, but in regions with rich soil and careful growers, they created vibrant floral notes that set one drink apart from the next. A guest might recognize a shrub by scent alone before tasting. One fringe belief held that shrubs infused with thyme protected against bad dreams. A cup before sleep, it was said, would calm the spirit. In some homes, this became routine. Children drank their thyme shrub with wrinkled noses, clutching worn blankets, their faces lit by firelight. Shrubs also accompanied storytelling. During long winter nights, as grandparents told tales of saints and monsters, a warm shrub might be passed around, steam curling into the air. The taste became associated with memory, with comfort, with nights spent together when the wind howled and nothing outside mattered. Because in the medieval world, shrubs were not just drinks, they were small declarations of hope. They were a way to stretch the season, to brighten a day, to make water taste like memory. They were stored in dark cupboards and brought out when the heat lingered, or when a guest arrived unexpectedly. They required care, but gave satisfaction. And so across markets, kitchens, and monastery halls, people stirred and sipped. They tasted the vinegar, smiled despite themselves, and refilled the cup. Somewhere beneath the castle kitchens, buried in stone cellars stacked with salted fish and dried herbs, rests a barrel with no label. The contents are dark, oily, perhaps slightly sweet. No one is entirely sure who made it, but every so often a cook taps the side, draws a wooden ladleful, and uses it to glaze a roast or sweeten a dish of stewed apples. It is molasses wine or something like it. And like many late medieval beverages, it lives in the blurred space between curiosity and survival. As the Middle Ages stretched into their later centuries, trade routes widened. Sugar arrived more regularly, though still expensively. New flavors began to enter the kitchens and marketplaces of Europe, often filtered through the lens of spice traders, returning crusaders, or enterprising merchants. And with sugar came syrups. With syrups came new kinds of drinks. One such drink involved boiling molasses with spices and mixing the thickened syrup into warm water or light ale. It was sticky, sweet, and rich with nutmeg or clove. People drank it as a tonic, as a treat, sometimes as a last resort when everything else had spoiled or fermented itself into oblivion. Historians still argue whether these sugar-based drinks qualify as early soft drinks or simply experimental brews. The lack of standardization makes classification difficult. What one household called a cordial, another might call a health draught. The ingredients overlapped, the intentions differed. But they all sought something stable, sweet, and comforting. One fringe recipe involved molasses boiled with crushed peppercorns and fennel, then cooled and poured into glass bottles sealed with wax. It was believed to cure sluggish digestion. Another version, made with sugarcane juice and cinnamon bark, was consumed at certain winter feasts in port cities. Its origins were likely borrowed, but its place in festive gatherings became local. In many towns, apothecaries began to stock syrupy drinks laced with herbs. Some were clearly medicinal, thick, bitter, and served by the spoon. Others danced the line sold as tonics or nourishing waters. These included orange blossom syrups, rosewater cordials, or elderflower infusions blended with raw sugar, meant to revive, to soften, to impress. The expansion of sugar also changed older recipes. Some households returned to barley water and added a spoonful of syrup. Others revisited mead, crafting lighter, sweeter variants for women and the ill. Even humble oat gruel sometimes received a splash of molasses if a family had connections or coin enough to spare. Sweet drinks carried status. Offering one to a guest said something. It was not merely hospitality, it was proof of access. A person who could waste sugar in a drink was a person of means. A person who could do it regularly might be whispered about in markets, their kitchen viewed with admiration or envy. Because sugar spoiled slowly, these drinks kept well. A sealed bottle might last through the season. Some were sent as gifts, particularly between households in trade towns. It was not unusual for a merchant's wife to send a flask of syrup cordial to a sister in a nearby village, the cork wrapped in ribbon, the note simple. For your tired days. Among the very wealthy, sweet drinks became symbols, painted goblets, frosted rims, silver ladles. These drinks were sipped after meals, sometimes alongside sweetmeats or candied nuts. It was fashionable to serve them cold with a sprig of mint or a sliver of orange peel when such things were available. The guests often praised the host, even when the drink was confusing or excessive. In more modest homes, sugar was stretched. A small jar of molasses might last for months. A few drops added to warm water gave the illusion of richness. One common drink involved boiling raisins with sugar and water until it thickened, then drinking the liquid with a hunk of dry bread. It was not elegant, but it was sweet, and that counted. Some monasteries embraced these drinks slowly. Others never did. Certain abbots viewed sugar with suspicion, linking it to indulgence or foreign vanity. But practical monks, especially those who managed infirmaries, accepted that a warm syrup could calm a patient, soothe a sore throat, or disguise the taste of an otherwise revolting medicinal blend. One fringe belief held that sugar gladdened the blood. A syrup made of honey, lemon peel, and violet was said to restore joy. It was recommended for melancholia, for bad weather days, and for widows too long in mourning. Whether it helped is unknown, but the intention carried meaning. Late medieval recipes sometimes included dried fruit reduced into syrup, especially dates or figs brought from abroad. These were simmered with vinegar, clove, and sometimes almond milk, then served in small amounts. The taste was bold, layered, often unexpected. Some loved it, others preferred simpler fare. Because these sweet drinks often came from trade, they reflected changing geography. Port cities tasted different than inland towns. A drink made in Genoa bore no resemblance to one served in York. Regional variants became part of the tradition, and in some cases people spoke of beverages the way others spoke of distant relatives. Strange, interesting, not entirely trusted. As sugar became slightly more accessible, enterprising tavern keepers began to offer syrupy options. These were not for the hard drinkers. They were for travelers, women, the infirm. A man might order a spiced cordial while waiting out the rain, sipping slowly and listening to the guttering fire. A woman might take hers with warm bread, the taste sweet enough to distract her from the day's long walk. Cordial drinks often found their way into religious observances as well. They were served on feast days, especially among those who abstained from alcohol but still wanted something more than ale or water. The idea of joy without intoxication suited many pious households. It also suited priests who preferred a clear head after the evening mass. In colder climates, sweet drinks helped with the long winters. They offered calories, they warmed the belly. A mixture of sugar, boiled wine and spices might be left simmering on the hearth all day, ladled out as needed. Children were sometimes given the thinnest version, more spiced water than syrup, but still exciting, still different. And among the sick, sweet drinks offered both comfort and hope. To sip something warm and gentle after days of fever was to feel momentarily human again. To taste sweetness when everything else had turned bland or bitter was a reminder that the body had not entirely given up. One curious variation involved fermenting sugared rose petals into a mild drink called petal wine. It was rarely strong, often cloying, and frequently beautiful to look at. The colour varied from blush pink to pale amber, depending on the flower and the maker. Some claimed it cured coughs. Others served it for weddings. Everyone agreed it smelled better than it tasted. Even as the medieval world edged toward the early modern era, these sugar drinks persisted. They became more refined. Recipes appeared in household books. Glass bottles became more common. People argued about ratios, about timing, about which vinegar to use, or whether orange peel should be boiled or steeped. These arguments meant something. They marked the rise of personal preference. And in the end, what they produced was more than drink. It was labor bottled. It was patience poured. It was a small pleasure in a world where many pleasures came with danger, uncertainty, or expense. Because in the medieval world, sweet drinks were not merely recipes. They were adaptations, inventions, celebrations. They answered thirst with comfort, illness with sweetness, and routine with something new. And so from cellar to hearth, from monastery infirmary to market stall, the cups filled and emptied and filled again. The candle has burned low now, its flame fluttering more than it glows. The streets beyond are quiet. No carts rattle their wheels, no vendors call, no buckets splash at the well. The day has emptied itself like a jug tipped gently on its side. In some forgotten corner, an old wooden ladle rests against a barrel's rim, still damp from its last use. It is done for the night. So is everything else. The world you have wandered through, its damp stone cellars, smoke-streaked kitchens, bustling taverns and clattering marketplaces, has slipped into stillness. All the cups have been drained, the pots scrubbed clean, the flasks corked and stored away. There will be more to stir tomorrow, more to boil, to steep, to strain, but not now, not tonight. Now there is only the gentle hush of thought turning inward. You can imagine a quiet cottage where someone stirs a final cup of barley water, not because they are thirsty, but because it is familiar, because it warms the hands, because the act of stirring something soft and slow can remind the mind that there is nothing left to do. The heat rises from the cup, curls against the cool of the air, and the person does not drink it right away. They hold it, they watch the steam fade. That is enough. The medieval world did not always have comfort, but it had rituals. A woman wrapping cloth around her flask before setting out into winter. A man drawing just a spoonful of molasses from a tightly sealed crop. A child chewing a crust softened in vinegar, eyes already closing before the piece is gone. Each motion slow, thoughtful, practiced. These were the rhythms of survival, but also the shape of rest. You have wandered among those motions now. You have sat beside the hearth as ale was poured, watched the monk steep his herbs in quiet silence, stood in the shadow of a well where no one drinks plain water without hesitation. And all along, the people in these places have done what they could with what they had. They drank not to indulge, but to endure, and sometimes, when fortune allowed, to enjoy. There is something comforting in that, in knowing that even centuries ago, when life was narrower and colder, people still found ways to warm themselves. They brewed what they could, they sweetened what they could not, They mixed and stirred and sipped and hoped, not for miracles but for steadiness, for a morning that would not come too cold, too dry, or too hard to meet. The cups they used were chipped, the spoons rough, the barrels sometimes leaked, but none of that mattered. The act of drinking, of taking something into the body that would not harm it, was in itself a kind of quiet blessing. Imagine the sound of a ladle slipping back into a half-filled pot, the soft clink of ceramic touching stone, the sigh of someone leaning back, eyes half closed, as the fire settles to embers. No one speaks, there is nothing that needs saying. That is where we are now. You have travelled through time not to witness great battles or throne rooms, but to linger in kitchens, to stand beneath rafters strung with drying herbs, to sip beside the sick, to taste the patience of survival. And now there is nothing more to do. The drink is finished, the vessel empty, the stories told, the fire low. Let the flavours fade, vinegar and honey, barley and mint, molasses and rosehip. Let the smells curl away, wood smoke, boiled oats, the faintest sweetness of overripe fruit in an open market. Let them fall behind you like tools laid carefully back in their place. You are not holding anything now. There is no cup, no kettle, only breath. Only the quiet of a world that once turned on so many simple motions, and which for now has gone utterly still. Let that stillness stay. Sleep well.